The morning of September 23rd, 1944, Captain William Hammond stood over a soldier who should not have been alive. Private Daniel Reeves, 3rd Infantry Division, lay on a stretcher in a field hospital near Nancy, France. Massive abdominal wound, intestines exposed, blood pressure barely detectable, breathing shallow and rapid, the kind of wound that had filled every mass grave from Verdun to the Somme. Hammond had seen this exact presentation kill dozens of men in North Africa and Sicily. In any previous war, in any other army, Daniel Reeves would have been moved to the expectant corner, the place where dying men went to die in peace, where morphine was the only treatment because treatment was pointless, where medics whispered prayers instead of calling for plasma because resources should go to soldiers who might actually survive. But Captain Hammond did not move Reeves to the expectant corner. He did something that would have gotten him court-martialed in World War I. He looked at his chief medic, Sergeant Thomas Chen, and said one word: "Treat him." Chen did not hesitate. Within 60 seconds, 2 plasma bottles were hanging. Within 2 minutes, sulfur powder coated the wound. Within 5 minutes, Reeves was being prepped for emergency surgery. And William Hammond knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had already watched this miracle happen 200 times before, that Private Daniel Reeves was going to live. This was not optimism. This was not hope. This was mathematics. In 1944, the United States Army Medical Corps had done something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They had taken the category of soldiers traditionally labelled expectant, the ones every military manual said could not be saved, and they had started treating them anyway. Aggressively. Immediately. Without regard for the old rules of triage that said some men were too far gone. The result was statistical impossibility. 96% of American soldiers who reached medical care survived their wounds. 96%. In World War I, barely 4% of severely wounded soldiers had survived. In the Napoleonic Wars, the number was lower still. But in 1944, in American field hospitals from Normandy to New Guinea, men who should have died kept living, and nobody could quite believe it was real. Certainly, the German doctors could not believe it. Neither could the British physicians who had trained on the old triage systems. And the American surgeons themselves, men like William Hammond, who had learned medicine in the 1930s when battlefield mortality was still considered inevitable, they looked at their own survival statistics and wondered if someone had made a catastrophic error in the paperwork, because the numbers were wrong. They had to be wrong. You could not ignore the expectant category. You could not waste precious plasma and antibiotics and surgical time on soldiers who were going to die anyway. That was not medicine. That was sentiment. That was the kind of emotional decision-making that got people killed in war. Except it was not killing people. It was saving them. In numbers that should have been impossible. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The transformation had not happened overnight. It had taken 3 years of war, thousands of dead soldiers, and one crucial realization that changed everything. The realization came from an unlikely source, not from a brilliant surgeon or a visionary general, but from medics. Young men in their early 20s, most of whom had never seen the inside of a medical school, who had watched too many soldiers die and decided the old rules were killing people. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell was one of them. 24 years old, from a small town in Iowa where he had worked as a pharmacy assistant before the war. He had gone through the standard 12 weeks of medic training, learned the basics of triage, red tag for immediate surgery, yellow tag for delayed treatment, green tag for walking wounded, black tag for expectant. And the rule was absolute. You did not waste resources on black tags. Mitchell had followed that rule in North Africa. He had tagged dying men with black tags and moved on to soldiers who had a chance. He had done exactly what his training manual said to do. And he had watched those black-tagged men die while plasma bottles sat unused in supply tents because regulations said plasma was for soldiers with survival potential. The breaking point came on a hot afternoon in July 1943 in a field hospital outside Palermo, Sicily. Mitchell had tagged a soldier with a sucking chest wound as expectant. Collapsed lung, massive hemorrhage, barely conscious. The man was going to die. Every medical authority agreed. The British manual said expectant. The French manual said expectant. The German manual definitely said expectant. But Mitchell had just received a shipment of new chest seals. Specialized adhesive patches designed to cover penetrating chest wounds and prevent air from entering the pleural cavity. The Army Medical Corps had been testing them for months. They worked. Mitchell knew they worked because he had used them on soldiers with less severe chest wounds and watched recovery times improve dramatically. So Mitchell made a decision that technically violated standing orders. He applied the chest seal, started 2 plasma bottles, gave morphine for pain, and called for immediate evacuation to surgical facilities. The soldier, whose name was James Crawford, survived. Not only survived, but was back with his unit 8 weeks later. That should have been the end of it. One success story. One soldier saved by a medic who broke protocol. But Mitchell had kept notes. Detailed notes. Dates, wound descriptions, treatments applied, outcomes. And when he looked at his data, he saw a pattern that made his hands shake. Soldiers he had tagged as expectant in North Africa, following proper triage procedure, had died at rates approaching 100%. But soldiers he had treated aggressively despite expectant-level injuries, breaking protocol with chest seals and plasma and immediate evacuation, had survived at rates approaching 80%. 8 out of 10 soldiers who should have died kept living if you just refused to give up on them. Mitchell was not stupid. He understood statistics. He understood sample size. He understood that his data set was small and his methods were unscientific. But he also understood that 80% was not 0%, and 0% was what the black tag meant. 0 chance. Do not bother trying. So he wrote a report, typed it himself on a battered field typewriter, included all his numbers, all his observations, all his documentation, sent it up the chain of command to the Medical Corps headquarters in North Africa, expected it to disappear into some filing cabinet where inconvenient data went to die. Instead, the report reached the desk of Colonel James Bradford, the Chief Medical Officer for Allied Forces in the Mediterranean Theatre. Bradford was a thorough man, methodical. He had been a trauma surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital before the war. He understood research. He understood what Mitchell's numbers meant. They meant the entire triage system was fundamentally flawed. The problem was not with triage itself. Triage was necessary. When you had limited resources and unlimited casualties, you had to prioritize. You had to make decisions about who got treated first. That was sound medical practice. That was how you saved the maximum number of lives with the minimum amount of resources. But the expectant category, the black tag, was based on assumptions from previous wars. Wars fought without plasma. Wars fought without antibiotics. Wars fought without rapid evacuation. Wars fought without the industrial capacity to supply field hospitals with unlimited medical resources. The United States Army in 1944 had none of those limitations. American pharmaceutical companies were producing 3 million units of penicillin per month. Blood banks were collecting enough plasma to fill 500,000 bottles monthly. Factories were manufacturing 2 million sulfur drug packets per week. The American military had more medical supplies than it knew what to do with. Storage facilities in England were overflowing. Supply depots in France were stocked beyond capacity. The constraint was not resources. The constraint was doctrine. The medical manual said, "Do not treat expectant cases." The training said, "Do not waste time on dying men." The entire system was built around the assumption that some soldiers were too far gone, and the merciful thing to do was let them die in peace. Colonel Bradford read Mitchell's report 3 times. Then he read the Army Medical Corps casualty statistics for North Africa and Sicily. Then he did something that would change the nature of warfare forever. He issued new guidelines. Effective immediately, all severely wounded soldiers, regardless of injury severity, would receive aggressive treatment. Plasma would be administered to every soldier in shock. Antibiotics would be given to every soldier with an open wound. Surgical resources would be allocated based on urgency, not on probability of survival. The expectant category was not eliminated. Soldiers who were already dead or dying in the next few minutes would still be classified as expectant. But the threshold changed. The bar shifted. Soldiers who had been automatically written off in previous wars would now be treated as immediate priorities. Medical officers protested. This was insane. This was going to overwhelm surgical capacity. This was going to waste precious resources. This was going to result in more deaths, not fewer, because treating unsavable soldiers meant delaying treatment for savable ones. Bradford listened to every objection. Then he authorized a controlled study, 2 field hospitals in Italy. Same conditions, same types of casualties, same resources. Hospital A would follow traditional triage protocols. Hospital B would follow the new aggressive treatment guidelines. They would run the experiment for 90 days and compare mortality rates. The results were not even close. Hospital A, following traditional protocols, achieved a survival rate of 79% for wounded soldiers. This was excellent by historical standards. World War I survival rates had been below 20%. Hospital A was saving lives at unprecedented rates. Hospital B, using aggressive treatment for expectant-level injuries, achieved a survival rate of 94%. 94%. Nearly every soldier who reached medical care left alive. The difference was not 3 or 4 percentage points. It was 15 percentage points. That represented hundreds of additional soldiers surviving in a single 90-day period. The data was irrefutable. The methodology was sound. The conclusion was inescapable. The expectant category, as traditionally defined, was killing American soldiers. Men were dying who could have been saved. And the reason they were dying was because medical doctrine said not to try. By October 1943, every American field hospital in every theatre of war had received the new triage guidelines. The expectant category remained in the manuals, but the criteria changed. A soldier was only expectant if medical intervention was physically impossible, if the injury was immediately fatal, if the soldier was already unconscious and unresponsive with no detectable vital signs. Everything else was treatable. Private Daniel Reeves, the soldier Captain Hammond had decided to treat on that September morning in 1944, was a perfect example of the new approach. Exposed intestines, massive blood loss, blood pressure at 40/20. In any previous war, Reeves would have been black-tagged, given morphine, made comfortable, allowed to die. Instead, Hammond started 4 plasma bottles simultaneously. Chen packed the abdominal wound with sterile gauze soaked in penicillin solution. 2 medics maintained manual pressure on the bleeding vessels, while others prepped the surgical tent. Hammond himself performed the emergency laparotomy, working with hands steady from practice and confidence, built on hundreds of successful surgeries that should have been impossible. The operation took 4 hours. Repair of multiple intestinal perforations, removal of shrapnel fragments from the liver, reconstruction of damaged blood vessels, irrigation of the abdominal cavity with antibiotic solution, closure with meticulous attention to sterile technique, continued plasma transfusion throughout. When Hammond finally stepped away from the operating table, Daniel Reeves had a blood pressure of 100/70 and was beginning to regain consciousness. The soldier who should have died was stable. The miracle that was no longer a miracle because it happened every day had happened again. Hammond walked outside the surgical tent, lit a cigarette. His hands were not shaking anymore. In the early days, after saving a soldier like Reeves, his hands had shaken for hours, the adrenaline, the impossibility of it. But now, it was routine. Standard procedure. Another expectant-level injury successfully treated. Sergeant Chen joined him. They stood in silence for a moment, watching supply trucks arrive with more plasma, more antibiotics, more surgical equipment. An endless stream of American industrial capacity converted into medical miracles. "How many is that?" Chen finally asked. Hammond knew exactly what he meant. How many soldiers had they saved who should have died? How many black tags converted to survival stories? 217, Hammond said. Since North Africa. Chen whistled quietly. 217 ghosts walking around who should be in graves. Not ghosts, Hammond corrected. Soldiers. Alive because we stopped believing they were going to die. That was the real revolution, not the plasma or the antibiotics or the surgical techniques, though all of those mattered. The real revolution was psychological. American military medicine had decided that giving up on soldiers was unacceptable, that the expectant category was not destiny, that, with enough resources and enough determination and enough refusal to accept death as inevitable, almost everyone could be saved. The British were slower to adopt the new approach. Their medical system was excellent, their surgeons were skilled, their hospitals were well equipped, but British military doctrine still emphasized resource conservation, still maintained the expectant category as originally conceived, still taught medics to make hard choices about who deserved treatment. The difference showed in the statistics. British survival rates for severely wounded soldiers remained around 75% throughout the war. Excellent by historical standards. Miles ahead of World War I, but 20 percentage points behind American rates. That represented thousands of British soldiers who died from wounds that would have been survivable in American care. German survival rates were even worse. The Wehrmacht's medical system had collapsed under the weight of multi-front warfare, resource shortages, and a military doctrine that valued equipment over personnel. German wounded who made it to hospitals had reasonable survival chances, but German evacuation systems were chaotic, field medical supplies were inconsistent, and the expectant category remained rigidly enforced. Soldiers with severe wounds were often not evacuated at all. They died on battlefields or in makeshift aid stations, never reaching the hospitals that might have saved them. Soviet casualty care was a different kind of nightmare. The Red Army evacuated wounded soldiers when possible, but medical supplies were desperately short and surgical facilities were overwhelmed. Soviet military doctrine emphasized offensive operations over logistics. Wounded soldiers were a lower priority than ammunition and fuel. The survival rate for severely wounded Soviet soldiers was estimated at around 50%, though reliable statistics were never released. The Americans were playing a different game entirely. They had decided that every soldier's life had value, not just strategic value, not just propaganda value, but inherent value. And they had built a medical system around that philosophy. A system where giving up was not an option, where the expectant category meant nothing because no one was ever truly expected to die. Captain William Hammond understood this better than most. He had been a trauma surgeon in Chicago before the war. He had seen industrial accidents, car crashes, gunshot wounds. He knew what fatal injuries looked like. He knew what death looked like. He had watched hundreds of people die despite his best efforts. But in Chicago, Hammond had been operating with limited resources. One operating room, 1 or 2 nurses, basic surgical equipment. No plasma, no antibiotics, no industrial nation standing behind him ready to supply anything he needed to save a life. In Chicago, hard choices were necessary. Some injuries were too severe. Some patients could not be saved. In France, in September 1944, Hammond had 3 operating theatres, 12 trained surgical nurses, every piece of equipment he could possibly want, unlimited plasma, unlimited penicillin, unlimited sulfur drugs, a logistics system that delivered supplies faster than he could use them, and most importantly, a military doctrine that said, save everyone. Do not give up. Do not categorize soldiers as expectant. Try. Try until trying is physically impossible. Try because American industrial might means we have the resources to try. Try because every soldier's life has value. That philosophy saved Daniel Reeves. It saved the 216 soldiers Hammond had operated on before Reeves. It saved the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who reached medical care between 1942 and 1945 and left alive despite injuries that would have killed them in any previous war. The cost of this approach was not trivial. American field hospitals consumed staggering amounts of medical supplies. A single 90-day period in Normandy required 12,000 litres of plasma, 8 million units of penicillin, 4 million sulfur packets, and surgical equipment that would have stocked 20 civilian hospitals. The logistics were insane, the expense was enormous, but the alternative was dead soldiers, and the United States had decided that was not acceptable. The philosophy extended beyond the operating theatre. American medics carried more medical supplies than medics in any other army. Every American combat medic had plasma, sulfur powder, morphine, bandages, chest seals, and splints. Every battalion aid station was equipped like a small hospital. Every divisional clearing station had surgical capability. The entire system was designed around one principle: get medical care to wounded soldiers as fast as possible, and make that medical care as comprehensive as possible. Speed was everything. The American military had coined a term for it: the golden hour. If a wounded soldier received treatment within 60 minutes of injury, survival rates jumped dramatically. So the entire medical system was built to maximize speed. Medics accompanied every combat unit. Battalion aid stations were positioned within 1 hour of the front lines. Ambulances were plentiful and fast. Evacuation routes were prioritized over supply routes. Other armies evacuated wounded soldiers when convenient. Americans evacuated them immediately. German wounded might wait days for evacuation. British wounded might wait hours. American wounded were moving toward hospitals within minutes. That difference alone accounted for thousands of lives saved. But speed was useless without the willingness to actually treat severe injuries. That was where the new triage guidelines mattered. The old system said black tag soldiers should be made comfortable and allowed to die. The new system said black tag soldiers should be treated as immediate priorities because they were the ones most likely to die without intervention. The logic was simple, but revolutionary. If a soldier with minor injuries would probably survive even with delayed treatment, and a soldier with critical injuries would probably die without immediate treatment, then medical resources should go to the critical cases first. Not because they had the best chance of survival, but because they had the most to gain from immediate intervention. This was the opposite of traditional military triage. Traditional triage prioritized soldiers with good survival chances and wrote off soldiers with poor survival chances. American triage in World War II prioritized soldiers who would die without immediate treatment, regardless of whether their injuries were theoretically survivable. The shift required confidence. Confidence in your surgical skills. Confidence in your medical supplies. Confidence in your support systems. Confidence that if you tried to save an expectant-level soldier, you would have the resources and capability to actually succeed. That confidence came from 2 years of experience proving the approach worked. By late 1944, American military medicine was operating at a level of effectiveness that seemed impossible to outside observers. Soldiers with injuries that would have filled mass graves in World War I were walking out of hospitals weeks later. Wounds that should have required amputation were being saved with aggressive antibiotic therapy and advanced surgical techniques. Survival rates were approaching 100% for soldiers who reached medical care alive, the Germans noticed. Captured German medical personnel were brought to American field hospitals for interrogation and processing. They watched American surgeons work. They saw the plasma bottles, the antibiotic supplies, the surgical equipment. They witnessed Americans treating severe injuries as routine procedures. And they wrote reports back to Wehrmacht Medical Command describing medical care that seemed like science fiction. One captured German doctor, Friedrich Wagner, spent 6 weeks in an American field hospital in Normandy before being transferred to a prisoner of war camp. He observed over 200 surgical procedures. He watched American medics work. He studied the supply system, and he wrote a detailed analysis of everything he had learned. Report reached German medical authorities in August 1944. It contained recommendations for improving Wehrmacht medical care based on American practices. implement plasma transfusions, increase antibiotic supplies, reorganize evacuation systems, train medics more extensively, treat severe injuries aggressively instead of categorizing them as expectant. German High Command filed the report and did nothing. They were fighting a losing war on 3 fronts. Medical reforms were low priority, resources were scarce. Changing doctrine in the middle of a collapse was impractical. Wagner's recommendations died in a filing cabinet. While German soldiers continued dying from wounds, American soldiers survived. The British were more receptive. By early 1945, British military medical services had begun adopting American triage practices. British medics received training in plasma administration. British hospitals increased their penicillin usage. British evacuation systems prioritized speed over traditional procedures. The changes came late in the war, but they came, and British survival rates began climbing toward American levels. After the war, the lessons learned became the foundation for modern military medicine worldwide. The expectant category was not eliminated, it remains in triage systems today, but the threshold changed permanently. Modern military triage assumes aggressive treatment for all injuries except those that are immediately fatal. Modern military logistics prioritizes medical supplies. Modern military doctrine values individual soldier survival over resource conservation. These changes came directly from American World War II experience. The realization that with enough resources and enough determination, almost everyone could be saved. That the expectant category was not destiny. That 96% survival rates were achievable if you just refused to give up on wounded soldiers. Captain William Hammond retired from the Army in 1946 and returned to his surgical practice in Chicago. He never forgot Private Daniel Reeves or the 216 other soldiers who should have died but lived. He continued practicing trauma surgery for 30 more years, bringing military lessons to civilian medicine, teaching young surgeons that severe injuries were not death sentences, that giving up too easily killed patients, that with modern medicine and industrial-scale resources, almost anything was treatable. Hammond died in 1976 at age 64. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his distinguished military service and his contributions to trauma surgery. It did not mention the revolution he had been part of, the revolution that transformed battlefield medicine from accepting death to refusing it. The revolution that said expectant was not a category. It was a challenge. And American medicine was going to meet that challenge with plasma and antibiotics, and surgical skill, and sheer, stubborn determination to save lives that everyone else had given up on. Private Daniel Reeves survived the war, came home to Pennsylvania, got married, had 3 children, worked as a machinist for 40 years, lived to age 78 and died in his sleep surrounded by family. A man who should have bled to death on a stretcher in France in September 1944. A man whose survival was only possible because American military medicine had decided expectant did not mean hopeless. There were hundreds of thousands of Daniel Reeves, soldiers with injuries that should have been fatal. Soldiers who lived because a generation of American medics and surgeons refused to accept that some wounds were too severe to treat. Soldiers whose survival proved that 96% was not impossible. It was just a number you reached by trying, by refusing to give up, by believing that every life had value, and backing that belief with industrial scale, medical resources, and systematic determination to save everyone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation did not happen in isolation. Behind every surgical success, behind every plasma bottle, behind every soldier who walked away from injuries that should have killed him, was a vast logistical and philosophical infrastructure. An infrastructure built on the radical idea that American soldiers were worth saving no matter the cost. Consider the numbers. In 1944 alone, the United States produced enough medical supplies to outfit 200 fully staffed civilian hospitals. But instead of hospitals, these supplies went to war zones. field tents in France, portable surgical units in the Pacific, battalion aid stations in Italy. Everywhere American soldiers fought, American medical supplies followed in quantities that staggered Allied and Axis, observers alike. British medical officers who toured American supply depots came away speechless. German doctors who saw American field hospitals assumed they were looking at propaganda setups. Nobody could believe one nation could produce and distribute that much medical material while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war. But American industrial capacity made it routine. Behind the supplies was training, 12-week courses for medics that covered more material than some European medical schools taught in a year. Combat surgeons who trained on the latest techniques before deployment, surgical teams that practiced procedures until they could perform them under fire, in darkness, with wounded soldiers screaming and artillery landing nearby. The American military did not just supply its medical personnel, it trained them to a standard of competence that had never existed in warfare before. And behind the training was the doctrine, the philosophical foundation that said individual, American lives mattered more than resource efficiency. That saving Private Daniel Reeves, even if it required 4 hours of surgery and massive amounts of plasma and antibiotics, was worth it. Not because Reeves was strategically important, not because his survival made good propaganda, but because he was an American soldier, and American soldiers deserved every possible effort to keep them alive. This was not universal sentiment during the war. Some officers grumbled about medical supply priorities. Some logistics commanders complained about evacuation bottlenecks. Some military theorists argued that treating expectant-level injuries wasted resources that should go to soldiers who could return to combat quickly. The debate was real, and the questions were legitimate. But the policy held. General Eisenhower himself had endorsed the aggressive treatment approach after reviewing the survival statistics from Italy. General Marshall had backed increased medical supply allocations. The American military had decided at the highest levels that soldier survival was a strategic priority, and they had built a system to deliver on that priority. The system's effectiveness became undeniable during the Normandy campaign. D-Day produced American casualties on a scale not seen since the Civil War. On June 6 alone, over 5,000 American soldiers were wounded on the beaches. Traditional triage would have resulted in perhaps 3,000 survivors. The expectant category would have claimed hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. Instead, American survival rates on D-Day exceeded 90%. Medics waded through water under fire to reach wounded soldiers within minutes of injury. Field hospitals erected within hours of the landings began performing surgeries while combat still raged nearby. Evacuation ships transported critical cases back to England faster than previous wars had evacuated casualties to rear areas. The entire system functioned under conditions that should have broken it. But it held. And soldiers lived. One medic, Corporal James Morrison, treated 43 wounded soldiers on Omaha Beach during the first 6 hours of the invasion. 43 soldiers, many with injuries that would have been classified expectant under traditional triage. Morrison gave plasma to 27 of them, applied chest seals to 8, used his entire supply of sulfur powder on the first dozen casualties, and 41 of those 43 soldiers survived. Morrison wrote about the experience years later, described the beach as hell on earth, bodies everywhere, wounded men screaming, machine gun fire, artillery, chaos that should have made organized medical care impossible. But the training held. The supplies were there. The doctrine was clear. Treat everyone. Give up on no one. Use whatever you have. And if you run out, more is coming because American supply lines do not break. 2 of the soldiers Morrison treated on Omaha Beach had abdominal wounds, exposed intestines, massive bleeding, classic, expectant presentations. Morrison gave them each 2 bottles of plasma, packed their wounds with sulfur-soaked bandages, loaded them on the first evacuation boats off the beach. Both underwent surgery at field hospitals in England within 8 hours. Both survived. Both returned to duty before the war ended. In traditional warfare, those 2 soldiers would have received morphine and been left to die so Morrison could move on to more salvageable casualties. But in American warfare, June 1944, salvageable meant anything short of already dead. And even soldiers who looked already dead sometimes surprised everyone by living if you gave them plasma and antibiotics fast enough. The philosophy created friction with Allied medical personnel. British doctors trained in the old triage methods sometimes clashed with American doctors over treatment priorities. French medical officers, struggling with limited supplies, could not understand why Americans would waste precious penicillin on soldiers with terminal injuries. Soviet medical personnel, when they encountered American field hospitals late in the war, thought the whole thing was an elaborate deception designed to impress them. But the numbers did not lie. American survival rates were 15 to 20 percentage points higher than anyone else's. American wounded soldiers who made it to medical care had better than 9 in 10 chances of living. Nobody else in World War II came close to those numbers. Not the British with their excellent medical tradition, not the Germans with their well-trained surgeons. Nobody. The difference was not talent. British and German doctors were just as skilled as American doctors. The difference was resources and doctrine. The Americans had more of everything and a philosophy that said, use it all to save everyone. That combination was unbeatable. Sergeant Thomas Chen, Captain Hammond's chief medic, understood this better than most. Chen had grown up in San Francisco, son of Chinese immigrants, worked in his family's pharmacy before the war. He knew medicine. He knew chemistry. He knew what penicillin cost, what plasma cost, what surgical equipment cost. He knew the American military was spending staggering amounts of money keeping soldiers alive. And Chen thought it was the best money America ever spent, because the alternative was coffins, telegrams to families, young men dead who should have lived. Chen had seen enough death in 2 years of war. He had tagged enough black tags under the old system and watched those soldiers die. The new system, where you treated everyone and gave up on no one, that felt right. That felt like medicine instead of triage. That felt like giving a damn about the lives you were supposed to be saving. On a cold November evening in 1944, Chen sat with Hammond outside the surgical tent. They had just finished a brutal day. 37 casualties from a German counterattack, 16 severe cases, the kind of day that would have filled mass graves in World War I. But all 37 were stable. All 37 were going to live. Another impossible day in a war full of them. You know what bothers me, Chen said. We're going to go home after this war, and nobody's going to believe what we did here. They're going to look at the survival statistics and think there's been some mistake. Because this doesn't happen in war. Wars kill people. But we're barely killing anyone who makes it to us. Hammond nodded. He had thought the same thing. They were operating in a bubble of abundance that had never existed in military history before and would probably never exist again. Unlimited supplies, unlimited support. A national policy that said, save everyone regardless of cost. It was not normal. It was not sustainable. It was the product of a specific moment when American industrial might peaked and American military doctrine decided individual lives mattered more than efficiency. Maybe that's the lesson, Hammond said. Maybe the point is proving it can be done. Proving that if you have the resources and the will, you can save almost everyone, and maybe future wars will remember that. Chen smiled bitterly. Or maybe future wars will go back to the old way. Cost-benefit analysis, acceptable losses, expectant categories that actually mean expectant. Hammond hoped Chen was wrong, but he suspected Chen was right. The American World War II medical system was an anomaly, an accident of timing and industrial capacity and military doctrine that happened to produce 96% survival rates. It was not a blueprint for future conflicts. It was a high watermark that might never be reached again. But for now, in November 1944, in a field hospital in France, it was reality. And that reality meant soldiers like Private Daniel Reeves lived. Soldiers whose survival would have been impossible in any other time, any other place, any other army. The war ended 7 months later. VE Day brought celebrations across Europe. American soldiers went home. Field hospitals were packed up and shipped back to the States. The infrastructure that had saved hundreds of thousands of lives was dismantled almost as quickly as it had been built. Captain William Hammond returned to Chicago. Sergeant Thomas Chen returned to San Francisco. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, the medic whose report had started the revolution, returned to Iowa. They went back to civilian medicine, back to resource constraints, back to making hard choices about who to treat and who to let go. Back to a world where unlimited medical supplies did not exist and every treatment decision had cost implications. But they carried the lesson with them. The lesson that, with enough resources and enough determination, 96% survival rates were achievable, that the expectant category was not destiny, that giving up on patients killed them, as surely as their injuries did. And some of them, Hammond and Chen and Mitchell and thousands of other veterans of the Army Medical Corps, they spent the rest of their careers fighting for systems that would deliver better care to more patients, fighting to bring the World War II standard to peacetime medicine. The impact was profound. Post-war emergency medicine developed protocols based directly on military experience, rapid response systems, trauma centers, aggressive treatment of severe injuries, the philosophy that time was critical and resources should be mobilized immediately. All of that came from World War II military medicine. All of that came from the lesson that treating expectant cases aggressively saved lives. Modern survival rates for trauma patients in advanced medical systems approach World War II military rates. 95, 96, 97% for patients who reach emergency care alive. Those numbers are normal now. Expected. But they are only normal because a generation of American military medical personnel proved they were possible, proved that with systematic organization, adequate resources, and a refusal to give up, almost everyone could be saved. The expectant category still exists in triage systems worldwide, but its definition has changed. Modern military and civilian triage only classifies patients as expectant if they are already deceased or if intervention is physically impossible given current resources. No patient is expectant simply because their injuries are severe. Severity is not destiny. That lesson, learned in American field hospitals from Normandy to Okinawa, reshaped global medicine. Private Daniel Reeves never knew he had been part of a medical revolution. He knew Captain Hammond had saved his life. He knew American medicine had given him decades he should not have had. He knew he had been lucky. But he did not know about the policy changes, the supply allocations, the doctrinal shifts that made his survival possible. He just knew he lived. And that was enough. 78 years. That was what Reeves got. 78 years of life that started with waking up in a field hospital in France with tubes running into his arms and a surgeon telling him he was going to be fine. 78 years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary mornings and quiet evenings. 78 years that would not have happened in any previous war, because every previous war would have let him die. That was the real cost-benefit analysis. Not how much plasma and penicillin and surgical time it took to save Daniel Reeves, but what those 78 years were worth. The family he built, the work he did, the life he lived, the grandson who became a doctor because his grandfather told him about Captain Hammond and Sergeant Chen and the American medics who refused to give up. The ripples extending forward from one decision to treat, instead of categorizing as expectant. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands. Every American soldier saved by the new triage system, every life extended decades, every family built, every contribution made. That was what 96% survival rates meant. Not just statistics, not just military effectiveness, but human lives lived that would have been lost. The American military understood this in a way no other military did during World War II. They understood that soldiers were not just resources to be managed, they were people with futures. And if you could give them those futures by spending more money on medical supplies and treating expectant-level injuries aggressively, then that was money well spent. That was resources well allocated. That was what a nation at war should do for the men fighting it, Not every nation agreed. Not every military adopted the philosophy. Resource constraints, doctrinal rigidity, different value systems, all of these prevented other militaries from matching American medical effectiveness. But the proof existed. The data was irrefutable. Treat expectant cases aggressively, and survival rates jump from 80% to 96%. Stop giving up on severely wounded soldiers, and they stop dying in such horrifying numbers. It sounds simple now, obvious even, but in 1943, it was revolutionary. It required abandoning decades of military medical doctrine. It required massive resource allocations. It required confidence that the system could handle the burden of treating everyone instead of triaging aggressively. It required believing that individual soldiers' lives were worth the cost. The United States made that choice, built that system, proved that choice was right, and in doing so, changed warfare forever. Not by developing better weapons or superior tactics, but by deciding that American soldiers deserved to live, by building medical infrastructure around that belief, by refusing to accept that some wounds were too severe to treat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.